Wow. Okay, so last one of the night. It's been a very long night, and I'm here to talk about politics, of all things, this week. So hopefully the events of the last week and the last year have made everybody ready to perhaps do a little bit of thinking significantly differently about this problem of politics. This is the single most insightful, lucid, and honest analysis of our contemporary political situation that I've seen so far. I'm being quite serious, because she acknowledges the fact that we actually can't make sense of what is going on. And this is a deep insight, because a big piece of what in fact is going on is that we're right in the middle of a transfer of power between one comprehensive way of sense-making and another quite different comprehensive way of sense-making. Right? So for the past century and a half or so, we've been under the sway of a form of sense-making that we can call the Encyclopedia Britannica model. Right? It's one characterized by experts. They have the authority and the responsibility to pull social information back to centers of excellence, to process, to analyze, to evaluate, and then to output the authoritative truth for us to then act on. And it's actually a pretty effective way of sense-making. It worked, right? It brought us all the way through the 20th century and brought us to where we are right now. It's got notable blind spots, and unfortunately, it's extremely subject to control and manipulation. But it was the dominant form up until relatively recently. Now, in part, this is because this form of sense-making was founded on top of a form of media, a centralized mass media topology that gave rise to and supported this form of sense-making. And of course, for the past several decades, we've been in the process of replacing that kind of media with a new form of decentralized media, the internet and social media and whatnot. And on top of this new media infrastructure, there is currently growing organically a new form of sense-making that operates under completely different rules. And we might call it the Wikipedia model. John Robb, who thinks about these sorts of things a lot and is by far the best thinker in this area, calls them network tribes and open source insurgents right now. And perhaps the best example are from the contemporary political, in the last election, are known as the autists of Keck and meme magic. Do we happen to have any autists of Keck in the audience? Yes, a few? Great. Well, because as a technology entrepreneur, when I look at this kind of a dynamic, what I see is Schumpeter curves, waves of creative destruction. Like when Nokia, remember, they owned the cell phone market until the iPhone came along and swept them from the table. Or when, remember, Blockbuster was a monolith in home video, and Netflix came along and swept them from the table. Well, the news is, under this way of looking at things, the events of this last election are not an anomaly. Right? They're the evidence of cracks that have been opening for a very long time. And the future of politics belongs to the network tribes. Right? So in part, the rest of this presentation is really for the autists of Keck and for the other network tribes out there, because the first step is easy, the next step is hard. So when I look at the question of politics right now, I actually have to go a lot deeper. Because I look at it and I say, okay, politics is under the process of being disrupted by these new media technologies. But then I look at the technologies themselves, and I look at exponential technology growth and say the problem of technological unemployment, which is in the process of obsoleting the way that we go about doing labor and paying people to feed themselves. Or I look at, say, the ecosystems and the environment and resources that are in the process of obsoleting the current way that we go about relating to our physical environment. And so when I look at this whole system, I actually start seeing a whole bunch of different kinds of S-curves that are all aligning in the mother of all S-curves, right? And I think what we're actually looking at is a wholesale disruption of our entire civilization model, right? The kind of thing that comes along only once every 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 years. This is kind of a big deal. And by the way, it frankly puts a lot of what's been going on for the past year in a bit of perspective. Now, historically, we've actually navigated these kinds of transitions a little poorly. We could get away with it, though. Rome falls, and for a few centuries, we've got a dark age going on somewhere around the Mediterranean, but humanity marches on. The problem is, this time is different. For the very first time, we are all enmeshed in a comprehensive global civilization fabric. Right? 7.5 billion of us, many of whom are just still learning how to make it work, all of whom are getting better and better every day at killing each other, and pushing the absolute limits of all the infrastructure that we have. So we're at a precipice, and if we drop the ball, it could in fact be something we never recover from. At the same time, the prophets of abundance are not wrong. Right? These exact same exponential technologies, the exact same 7.5 billion people are exactly positioned to deliver on a level of flourishing and well-being that is dreamt of only in science fiction and poetry. So we are right now in a historical moment. We're at a moment of choice, a pivot point between one future and another future. Or, as Stuart Brand put it, we are as gods, and we must get good at it. So, how do we get good at being gods? Well, that's obviously a big question, but one piece of that I'd like to talk about. But to do it, I'm going to have to introduce some conceptual models that are not yet common currency. In particular, I want to talk about a model introduced a little over a decade ago by my friend Dave Snowden. Not Ed Snowden, Dave Snowden. He's an applied complexity theorist. It's called the Cynefin model. And in this model, what Dave does is he identifies that there's a number of different, very distinct kinds of ordered systems, right? Ways that systems can behave. And not just different kinds, but also different ways that we should relate to them. So, for example, consider what he calls a simple or an obvious system, like a pendulum swinging back and forth, or a game of tic-tac-toe. Right? The states available in the system are very small, they don't change. Even a child can just observe the system for a while, grasp the whole thing, and master it. And in fact, that's exactly the right way to approach a simple or an obvious system. Identify it, download the best practices, implement and execute. Things are different when you're dealing with a complicated system. A complicated system is one where the number of available states is vast. Think like, say, 777, the operating manual of the Boeing 777, or the entire American power grid. These are systems where the set of states is so vast that it's implausible that a person could ever really grasp the whole system. But they're regular, right? The relationship between cause and effect is reasonably predictable. And in principle, you could actually print out the entire manual of the 777, and it's all there, right? So you can build expertise. And if you have a group of people who are all trained in the operations of this system, you can actually manage it. And in fact, that's largely what we do in our current civilization, is that we build and manage complicated systems. And we're actually pretty good at it. The problem arises when we get to the next kind of system, the truly complex. Now, what's odd is that we're really just beginning to get our heads around complex systems. And this is odd because almost everything that really matters is complex systems. Climate, ecosystems, biology, human relationships, economies, these are all complex systems. And what I mean by that is that these are systems where the states that are available to the systems themselves can change. In fact, they change all the time. They change as a result of the dynamics of the feedback loops of the components of the systems themselves. They change as a consequence of the system interacting with its environment and evolving. Our agency in the system will change the system, and the connection between our cause and effect is effectively impossible to really predict. What this means is that the whole toolkit of approaches that we do so very well in managing complicated systems don't work at all for complex systems. And in fact, quite often, they are defeated, right? They're counterproductive. So we might say that a big piece of learning how to be gods is actually learning how to use the tools of complicated systems appropriately and learning how to treat complex systems authentically. And what we do right now is we grasp a complex system and we try to bound it and treat it always as a complicated system. And this is really inevitably setting us up for failure. So what does that look like in, say, the domain of politics, in governance? Now, with this framework in mind, what I'd like to say is that governance as a concept is already really kind of getting started off on the wrong foot. Governance is complicated. Governance is the design of some complicated structure attempting to impose and manage complex human social life, right? And these kinds of systems have a hard time. The way that complicated systems adapt to complex environments is that they actually tend to get more and more complicated, and complication is expensive. This is how you get from the Constitution to the TPP. And that's not a bug, that's a feature, that's how it works. That's just the dynamic. Another feature of these kinds of complicated systems is they involve an alienation of agency. Once you've built the complicated machine, you put the agency into it. Right? So say, for example, the role of the president. The president in the structure has agency, but the human being has agency only to the degree that he is playing that role. And we, poor citizens, have agency only to the degree to which we're getting to choose between one of two people to play the role. I don't know about you, but I've actually been feeling alienated from my agency recently. So what might be an authentically complex approach to the problem of managing human social organization, right? I'm going to call this collective intelligence. And collective intelligence is founded upon a meshwork of collaborative enhancing sovereignty. Now, I know sovereignty is a loaded term. When I say sovereignty, I definitely don't mean guys with guns out west. I don't mean Hobbes's Leviathan, which is just the view of sovereignty perverted through the lens of governance. What I actually mean is this guy, all right? What I mean is a real active human capacity, the capacity to maintain your own agency, your own self-mastery, even in environments that are adverse. I mean, a very simple, prosaic example. Let's say you've got a young parent, say a young father, and he has a crying baby. And if he has sovereignty, he's able to respond to the situation effectively. Right? He has emotional resilience. It doesn't get pulled into the drama. He has the tools to deal with it effectively, even if that just means asking for help. And if he lacks sovereignty, he gets pulled into it. He becomes reactive. He becomes a crying baby himself, and he loses the capacity to have any real agency, quite often just selecting from a series of habituated responses that are very unlikely to be effective. So the problem of collective intelligence is very deeply related to the problem of sovereignty and how we construct human coherences around mutually reinforcing sovereignty. I'll give you an example that we're actually pretty good at right now. And this is in the super hyper local space. I don't mean cities and towns. I mean like elite special forces teams or startup companies. Right? These are environments where groups of people organize to try to solve a problem. They're deeply in alignment with each other. They recognize that the success of the whole is deeply tied to the increasing capacity to act, the increasing sovereignty of each member. And when decisions need to be made, they're organically routed to the right people or groups of people. When conflict arises, it has to actually be resolved. It can't be adjudicated. It has to be resolved. It has to be healed, or new capacities have to be built to make it no longer relevant. And this is the exact appropriate response to lived complexity. This kind of a collective intelligence is highly adaptive to the unpredictable nature of complexity. And this is why startup companies are so much more effective at navigating innovation space, which is complex, than large, much better resourced corporations that are actually operating in a state of complication. Right? So at the hyper-local level, in these narrow bands, we're actually pretty good at building these kinds of things. They're built on things like deep trust, responsibility, healing. But we don't know how to scale them. And when you start adding people into these groups, 20, 40, 60, certainly when you get to the Dunbar limit, they start to break down. They either balkanize into sub-tribes or they have to flop over to some form of hierarchy. So the challenge is, how do we scale these techniques of collective intelligence? How do we scale things like trust and responsibility and healing? So that then brings us finally back to the beginning of the conversation, to the problem of sense-making. Because our current circumstances, I believe, offer us a very interesting and singular opportunity. The fact that an entire architecture of legacy sense-making is in crisis, the fact that a critical mass of people right now recognize deep down, like viscerally, that they can't trust the authorities that they used to rely on, means we have an opportunity to present them with a new mechanism, a new architecture for collaborative sense-making. And if we design it in a way that it actually generates collective intelligence, it's based upon mechanisms of a meshwork of sovereigns, then if they adopt it and if they use it and it scales, we've solved one of the biggest problems, right? The executive function of a collective intelligence. So let me wrap up by just describing what I think are the parameters of this kind of an architecture. This is very Maven-y stuff, if we remember that language from earlier. The first is that it has to be intrinsically resilient to capture, control, and censorship, right? At an architectural level, physically, at the design level. Now, fortunately, we're actually pretty good at that, right? This is just meaning that it needs to be deeply decentralized so that no centralized structure can take over, and when a centralized structure tries to take over, the architecture adapts to that. We can solve that problem. The second is more subtle. The second is that the architecture needs to be sensitive to and to down-regulate bad faith discourse. And bad faith discourse, propaganda, deliberate manipulation, advertising, even recklessness with the signal that you're putting into the collective. This is absolutely anathema to collective intelligence and is probably the number one and possibly the only cardinal sin of the future of what we're doing. So the system actually needs to be extremely sensitive to that, and this is probably through some variety of reputation tokens and currencies and things like that, so the decentralized environment can help the system identify and then down-regulate bad faith discourse. The third is subtler still. The third has to do with the fact that the system needs to be able to identify and decohere master narratives. Now, the point here is that what we want, what we need, is your authentic experience. As a member of this human sensor network, we need you to tell your stories, right? Your actual lived first-person experience of being in the world, and provide your perspective. Because if we have this giant omni-perspective sphere looking at reality, that's how we understand what reality really is. But the second you're actually telling somebody else's story, right, the second you're pre-processing your experience through some other lens, that's how we get into echo chambers. And that's how we fall into a collective delusion. So the system also has to be resilient to that, and it needs to make sure that it pushes authority and responsibility all the way to the edge. It is all about collecting people's stories as they're living them on a very continuous basis, and then any synthesis that's made is fluid and very gentle. So that's it. All right, that's where we are. Now, I'd like to leave you with just two considerations. If this sounds hard, which it is, consider the stakes. Right? Consider the pivot point that we're at right now. We're definitely going to have to work hard to make it through this century, and that's not an objection. If it sounds impossible, consider the sense maker you're using to make that assessment and how effectively it's been predicting things for you for the past, say, year. Because in my experience, things have this weird habit of going from absolutely impossible to completely inevitable in the most surprising ways. All right, that's all.